Laura Hackett talked with the Secretary about the great infrastructure needs of the area in the aftermath of the storm.
So I know you're not here yet, but from your vantage point, what is the scope of this damage, especially to infrastructure that you've been, seeing and hearing, that Helene has brought to Western North Carolina and Tennessee?
Clearly, the scope of the damage is enormous, as it has been in terms of the impact on everyday life for so many people in the region. It's part of why we have such intensive focus in the administration on the continued effort. And we know that work and those needs are going to be there for a long time, and so are we. It will be, I think, useful to see firsthand some of the impacts, speak with people who've been affected. But from day one, and really before day one, with the pre-positioning of federal personnel, we've been focused on how we can be helpful. Look, some of the descriptions that we've heard, especially as I was in video conferences with North Carolina emergency personnel alongside other states coming into FEMA headquarters, have been utterly shocking. We have not had a storm like this, certainly in the time that I've had this assignment. And so we recognize that this is really something of historic proportions, not just for North Carolina and Tennessee, but really for the United States.
Yeah, it's been shocking just to hear how many times the word devastation could be uttered in, in a 1-2 week span. So I think, in that vein, what we saw in Western North Carolina, particularly in Asheville and Buncombe, but everywhere, is just a massive infrastructure failure and that we've never really seen before. And so I think a big question on everybody's minds is, how can we stop this from happening again? How can we build our infrastructure so it can withstand, these weather patterns that are intensifying? So curious what, you and your administration are thinking about that.
This is something that's on our mind a great deal. We have, as part of the Biden-Harris infrastructure package, the first ever dedicated federal fund for resilience, projects that are going to help communities withstand the next disaster or threat. And I know it's on Governor Cooper's mind. It's one of the first things he raised when I called him to tell him we had the first $100 million in emergency relief money on the way. He talked about the desire to build back in a more resilient fashion than what we've inherited. It's been noted that many locations that were not considered to be a flood zone just a few years ago are now clearly vulnerable. And so it doesn't make sense to continue to expect designs and technologies and strategies that worked 50 years ago or 100 years ago to make sense in the 21st century. We obviously would hope and pray that a storm of these proportions will never again strike these same communities in Western North Carolina. But what we know for sure is that the United States is in for more extreme and frequent severe weather. And we have nothing to gain by pretending otherwise. We've got to work on this. And that's exactly what we're setting out to do, whether it's with reconstruction after the storm or more broadly with the infrastructure efforts that we're making. That can be everything from retrofitting a bridge to make it stronger to making sure we have new investments in evacuation routes to help people get out of the path of the next storm.
Thank you. And could you speak a little bit more specifically to, this idea of resilience with infrastructure, especially in terms of these rural areas that have really complicated topography? What we saw here was landslides. We saw bridges wash away, roads kind of fall off. And just curious, any other, specific things that work with our region's topography?
One thing we're looking a lot at is slope stabilization. First of all, that's part of the restoration effort. That's what some of the first few millions of dollars that we're deploying to North Carolina are going to go toward. But it's also an issue for the longer term, making sure that areas are either the roads are out of the way of slides, or that where you have a potential for a slide, that area is shored up. So that's just one example of the kind of investment and improvement we can make. But that takes resources. Like fixing a leaky roof, I would argue those resources are something that'll pay off in terms of the damage that can be prevented for the future. But we're going to have to take a hard look and ask ourselves hard questions about what it really takes to be ready for the next extreme weather event.
Changing gears a little bit, specifically you're coming to the area to check out I-40, which is, of course, is a core corridor from, Western North Carolina to Eastern Tennessee. I believe there is one route right now, but it's you have to go through the Smokies, the Great Smoky National Park. So not an ideal corridor. We've heard reports that that road may not be repaired until early next year, possibly. And so something I think folks are trying to wrap their head around is why does it take so long?
So we're talking about massive core structural damage. This isn't just an interruption or a cut into a road. We're talking about slopes that are permanently changed. And we're talking about critical bridges that were sometimes years in the making that were destroyed at one stroke. That being said, we're working closely with North Carolina's DOT to develop workarounds or temporary fixes so that vehicles can move, even if realistically we're looking at next year before some of these parts of I-40 can be stabilized or fully restored.
What is our region losing out on while this road does stay closed from your perspective?
Look, we know that these interstates are crucial for people's ability to access communities, for supply chains, for goods to get to where they're going. We know that there's an extraordinary tourism economy because of the natural beauty of this region, and that we're right in the middle of what would be a peak season. And, just earlier today, in the Roosevelt Room, the president's Homeland Security advisor convened a cabinet level discussion about the latest. And the Small Business Administrator was describing what she's learned from small businesses on the ground, talking about how they depend on this season in order to get the cash flow that'll get them through the year to come. SBA is working on supporting those businesses. But of course, I took that as powerful motivation to make sure we do everything we can to restore or improve ways for people to get in and out of those communities, whether we're talking about the people whose income sustains the businesses as visitors, or most importantly of all, but the people who live there and count on these roads and bridges for their everyday life.
Shifting gears a little bit, just on the note of resources. So, of course, at the end of the day, there's always a finite amount of money. That's why there's battles in Congress all the time. One thing that we're wondering in Western North Carolina is that, we've had some projects that honestly take a long time. Like the folks have been talking about expanding I-26 for probably decades at this point. We finally secured a bid for that. It was like a $1 billion contract, and that happened right before this happened, with the impact of Helene. So just wondering, any sense of like what's going to happen to those future infrastructure projects? Are those going to have to, unfortunately go to the back burner right now?
It's really going to depend on how the state prioritizes its way forward. We don't want to see a setback on any of the other infrastructure projects because often those are needed, and we remain committed to supporting them. If the state does decide to reprioritize what they're going to use transportation dollars for, of course, we will work with them to try to facilitate that. But also, part of why we want Congress, when it comes back, to address the need for emergency funding is that we really don't want there to be a choice forced on people who are facing this through no fault of their own. We want to make sure there's enough funding to restore what was destroyed, and that we can continue to move ahead on the forward-looking infrastructure projects that we're so proud to be helping with.
I think something that you've said, I believe you told one of our reporters this the other day, is that we need better transit options beyond just roadways, particularly in rural areas. In Asheville and Buncombe County and many other places in Western North Carolina, and I know this because I cover city government in normal times, we barely have enough money to pay for existing bus lines. So, what we're offering right now in our bus systems isn't enough. We have some bus routes that are only really able to run every hour and a half. Folks at the city and the county and the region, they want to expand transit, but they can't fit it in their budget. So just wanted to hear from you. How do we make this better? And how do we help support cities and counties who want to provide more reliable, accessible transit, but can't afford it?
Well, there's no silver bullet, but I would point to a couple of things. One is that we have in the Biden-Harris infrastructure package the most federal funding for transit that has ever been assembled. And so we're using that to help make sure that transit is supported and available. And when people think transit, they often think about the subway here in Washington, D.C., or a bus system serving Manhattan. But this isn't just for big cities, and this isn't just for subways. We believe that rural and less dense communities can and should have good transit too. The other thing I would point to is the role of technology. So in a less dense area, it may be that the hub and spoke model that you would use in one of America's biggest cities isn't well adapted to that local community. But that doesn't mean that you can't have transit, and especially as we see the kind of on-demand technology that's used by companies like Uber and Lyft. There are ways to apply that to be used by transit agencies for on-demand services that can make a big difference. We've also looked at strategies like bus rapid transit for those communities that are kind of in between. They're dense enough to want to have a fixed route system, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the expense of a light rail system is right for them. That's where bus rapid transit can get you a really good bang for your buck. So the bottom line is the answer is going to be different for different communities. It's not one size fits all. But we do need to be putting more resources into that, and we're trying to do just that with the federal dollars that we have.
For folks who don't know what bus rapid transit is, would you mind explaining that real quick?
So basically, imagine something that feels a lot like a tram or a streetcar, but it runs on a bus. And so what it means is you don't have to install rails. Often there's a dedicated lane for it, a bus only lane. Sometimes it's a shared lane. Again, it depends a little bit from one community to the next. But the point is that we can find so many different ways of delivering transit services. And bus rapid transit, what's called BRT, is a good example of that.
I want to zoom out a little bit. Right now, of course, I'm sure you're aware of, is we're working on recovery for multiple storms. So just on that note, do the recovery efforts from Hurricane Milton and the destruction in Florida and other places hinder our operations here?
Well, we're trying to do many things at once. It definitely is a lot of pressure. Of course, it's tons of pressure on, most of all, on the communities that have been impacted. There are certain areas of work like debris removal where it's becoming difficult to get enough contractors to do it. And it's also a strain on federal emergency management resources. But I will say FEMA and the other people who work on this day and night, they're pros, and they're used to doing a lot of things at once. And they're doing a great job of making sure that the resources are applied and that people get the attention that they need. But this is part of why we need to work with Congress in order to get this done. And I'll tell you, I've spoken with Democratic and Republican senators and governors. There's a real bipartisan desire, I think, to get something big done. And that's exactly what we're hoping will happen when Congress reconvenes.
When you say something big done, you're referring to like a larger funding package for FEMA and all of these emergency responses?
Yeah, for example, just the Emergency Relief Fund here at the U.S. Department of Transportation has billions of dollars in foreseeable need, and we have less than $200 million remaining. So we do have enough cash to get through the immediate requests that have come our way, like the $100 million from North Carolina and the $32 million from Tennessee. But we know there are many more requests where that came from. We're going to need to fill that fund with more resources so that we can meet its mission.
A question that's kind of on our audience's mind as well is, we have an election coming up and people are wondering, we're going to be repairing, recovering from these disasters for a long time, years. If there's a change in the administration, how might that affect the federal government and the DOT's ability to help places like Western North Carolina recover?
Well, I can't speak to any policy changes as opposed to what we believe in here in the Biden-Harris administration. But what I can say is that it is my hope and expectation that doing the right thing for communities that have been impacted like this would be a bipartisan priority. President Biden has promised communities that we're going to be there as long as it takes. I think he's said that, recognizing that much of this work will extend beyond this current presidential term. And it's going to be up to all of us, including Congress, to help make sure that that promise is kept.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.